Hey guys! Tonight we're going to wander off into the desert. Don't worry, I've packed the imaginary water skins and a few camels because tonight's story is all about the Silk Road. Yeah, that one. The glamorous trade route that stretched all the way from China to the Mediterranean. The one you probably half remember from high school history class, where your teacher droned on about caravans and spices while you stared at the clock. But here, we're going to slow it down. Way down. Think less National Geographic Adventure Special and more, let's tuck you in and ramble about camels for the next 90 minutes. So, dim the lights, fluff the pillows, and get ready to listen to what is essentially the world's most exhausting road trip. Because the Silk Road wasn't one road. It was a whole mess of them. Thousands of miles of dusty paths, rocky passes, marshy detours, and the occasional bandit-infested shortcut. And yet, for centuries, this was the lifeline of global trade. Well, as global as things got before Columbus decided to bump into the wrong continent. Now, the Silk Road gets its name from, you guessed it, silk. That shiny, luxurious fabric that everyone in Europe went absolutely feral for. Because nothing said, I'm better than you in the year 200 CE, like wrapping yourself in a material made from bug spit. And yes, silk is literally bug spit. But try telling that to some Roman senator who just paid half his fortune for a toga that looked fabulous but itched like crazy in the Mediterranean heat. But before we get too distracted by itchy senators, let's start where it all began, ancient China. Because without the Chinese figuring out how to domesticate silkworms and keep it a secret, the Silk Road wouldn't have existed. So picture this, somewhere around 2700 BCE, so basically forever ago, a Chinese empress named Lezu, or maybe just someone with that name in the legends, supposedly sat under a mulberry tree. She dropped her teacup and, because fate has a sense of drama, a cocoon plopped into her hot tea. Instead of fishing it out like a normal person, she apparently just started tugging at the threads. And surprise, surprise, silk was born. Was it really that cinematic? Probably not. More likely, some very bored and slightly desperate people just experimented with boiling bugs until they got fabric, because humans will literally mess with anything if it might turn into a blanket. But, legend or not, silk became China's best-kept secret. Exporting it was fine, but teaching foreigners how to make it? Absolutely illegal. People were executed if they tried to smuggle silkworms out. Which, if you think about it, is peak commitment to protecting intellectual property. Forget patents, just execute anyone who tries to copy you. Microsoft could never. Anyway, by the time we're in the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, silk wasn't just fabric, it was currency. Soldiers could be paid in rolls of it, bureaucrats collected it as tax, and nobles wore it to remind everyone else that they were, in fact, the sparkle elite. Which brings us to Emperor Wu of Han. He's the one who decided, hey, maybe we should expand our little trading bubble. Now, Emperor Wu wasn't exactly a chill dude. He had big empire on my mind energy. He wanted allies against those pesky nomadic tribes, the Xiongnu, who kept raiding Chinese borders. So he sent out this poor guy, Zhang Qian, as an envoy. Zhang Qian's mission was basically, go west, find friends, don't die. Naturally, he got captured almost immediately. Spent like 10 years in captivity, got married, had kids, and then one day just casually escaped and kept going. Which is kind of impressive, really. When Zhang Qian finally made it back to China, 20 years later, he hadn't exactly formed the alliances Emperor Wu wanted, but he had gathered a ton of intel. He'd seen horses in Central Asia that made Chinese horses look like sad little donkeys. He'd spotted grapes, new foods, new ideas. And Emperor Wu thought, okay, maybe we can work with this. So trade slowly opened up, and thus the Silk Road, in all its dusty, camel-heavy glory, began to take shape. Now, I know what you're thinking. But wasn't it dangerous? Oh, absolutely. The Silk Road was basically a never-ending gauntlet of things trying to kill you. If it wasn't the weather, burning deserts, freezing mountains, it was bandits. If it wasn't bandits, it was disease. And if you somehow made it through all that, you got to haggle with merchants who were professional-level scammers. Imagine spending months hauling your goods across the Gobi Desert only to have some guy in Samarkand tell you your precious silk is kind of last season. And speaking of Samarkand, let's pause on that. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, these were the cities that grew fat on trade. They were the Middle Eve equivalent of airport hubs. You'd stop, unload, maybe switch caravans, definitely overpay for food, and then keep going. The locals made fortunes being the middlemen because, let's face it, no single trader actually traveled the entire Silk Road. That would have been insane. Instead, goods hopped along like awkward, dusty hot potatoes. Chinese silk might pass through 20 different hands before some Roman noble got his toga. And each hand, of course, took a cut. And oh, the Romans! The Romans were obsessed with silk. They couldn't get enough. By the 1st century CE, silk was flooding into Rome. Senators wore it to show off, their wives wore it to show off, even emperors wore it. Though technically, Roman law banned men from wearing pure silk because it was considered too decadent, which naturally meant everyone immediately wore pure silk anyway. Laws are suggestions when you're rich. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some Roman moralists were horrified. They thought silk was corrupting Roman values. One senator even complained that silk made women naked in public, which, to be fair, probably just meant it was a little sheer. But leave it to Roman men to panic about fabric transparency. Meanwhile, the treasury was draining because Rome had to pay in gold and silver for this stuff, since they didn't exactly have much to trade back that China wanted. The Romans basically became silk addicts. Importing so much, China was practically Scrooge McDuck swimming in Roman coins. But the Silk Road wasn't just about silk. Oh no, spices traveled west, horses traveled east, glassware, precious stones, ivory, ID.
All right, so we've set the stage with China, bug-spit fabric, and Romans crying about see-through togas. But in between those two ends of the Silk Road was a whole buffet of civilizations who did what any smart person does when they see someone rich and desperate. They inserted themselves in the middle and took a cut. Because, let's be honest, the Silk Road wasn't really about brave merchants trekking all the way from Xi'an to Rome. That sounds romantic, like a Hollywood adventure movie with sweeping desert shots and a dramatic soundtrack. In reality, it was much lazier. A Chinese trader would sell his silk in Dunhuang. That guy would sell it to another in Kashgar. That guy would sell it to some Persian in Merv. And on until it reached some Italian merchant in Antioch who doubled the price, slapped a Made in the East tag on it, and sold it to a Roman senator who didn't ask questions. So really, the Silk Road was less one epic journey and more a long chain of people shrugging and saying, "Not my problem, pay me." And nowhere was this chain more obvious than Central Asia. If China and Rome were the impatient rich kids at opposite ends of the playground, Central Asia was the guy in the middle with the lemonade stand charging $5 a cup. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar thrived because they were perfectly placed between deserts and mountains. Caravans had to stop there, no matter how much they wanted to just keep walking, which meant they had to pay fees, taxes, and definitely overpay for stale bread and goat stew. Now, the Persians were absolute pros at this. Long before the Silk Road was officially a thing, the Persian Empire under Darius the Great had already built roads for their own use. They had the Royal Road, which stretched about 1,500 miles and had rest stations every 15 miles or so. Basically, the ancient world's version of a highway with service stations. Except instead of McDonald's, you got slightly less stale bread and probably a goat glaring at you. By the time the Silk Road was in full swing, the Persian territories were in the perfect position to collect tolls. Imagine being a Roman merchant trying to get your shiny silk back home. You'd finally drag your caravan out of the desert only to find some Persian tax collector waiting with a smile that said, "Pay up." because nothing screams economic genius like putting your empire directly in the way of other people's shopping sprees. And they didn't just tax goods, they controlled caravanserais, those little roadside inns where travelers could collapse for a night. These weren't exactly the Ritz. Think more like a walled courtyard, a few straw mats, some suspicious stew, and a lot of snoring camels. But when you've been trudging through sandstorms for a week, even a smelly mat probably felt like heaven. And of course, you had to pay for it. So the Persians and later the various Islamic caliphates made bank. And now let's float up a bit north to the Sogdians. If you've never heard of them, don't worry. They're one of those groups that history quietly swept under the rug, even though they were basically the Silk Road's MVPs. The Sogdians lived in Central Asia, mostly around Samarkand and Bukhara, and their entire cultural personality was middleman. They were polyglot merchants who spoke a dozen languages, wrote contracts, and basically made the Silk Road function. Without them, the whole system would have collapsed. Think of the Sogdians as the sketchy but reliable shipping company of the ancient world. You gave them your goods, and somehow, through a maze of bandits, deserts, and political drama, your silk or spices actually arrived at its destination. Sure, maybe a third of it disappeared along the way, but hey, that's the cost of business. The Sogdians were so good at this that even when empires rose and fell around them, they just kept trading. China respected them, Persia respected them, and later the Islamic caliphates respected them. Nobody really liked them because, let's face it, no one loves middlemen, but everyone needed them, which is basically the story of middle management for all of history. And while we're floating westward now, let's not forget the Parthians. Oh yes, the Parthians. You know, the empire everyone sort of skips in history class between Greeks and Romans. They were masters of horse archery, the famous Parthian shot, where they'd pretend to flee and then shoot you in the face while riding away. Not exactly neighbor of the year material. But more important for our sleepy story, they sat directly between Rome and China. And what did they do with this geographical jackpot? They blocked direct trade. That's right, when Roman envoys tried to march east to get their hands on silk at the source, the Parthians said, "Nope, you can only trade with us," which was basically them saying, "We're the exclusive middlemen now, deal with it." The Romans hated this. They complained about Parthian greed. They whined about the costs. But at the end of the day, they still bought the silk, because addiction doesn't care about your wallet. So if you're picturing all these caravans gliding along peacefully, let me gently ruin that, because the Silk Road was also a breeding ground for conflict. Every time a new empire rose in Central Asia, the taxes changed. Bandits were encouraged or crushed, depending on the ruler's mood. Some cities became rich, others were burned to the ground. Entire empires basically made their living taxing Silk Road trade and then collapsed as soon as someone else cut them off. Take the Kushan Empire, for example. They popped up in what's now Afghanistan and northern India, right along the Silk Road routes, and they milked it for all it was worth. They were middlemen for silk, spices, gems, and, fun fact, Buddhism, because the Kushans were huge in spreading Buddhism from India into Central Asia and eventually China. You might thank them for your local meditation app if they hadn't disappeared in the 4th century. But while they lasted, they thrived off caravans dragging themselves through mountain passes and happily paying Kushan tariffs. And speaking of mountain passes, let's talk about those for a second, because if there's one thing that made the Silk Road a nightmare, it was geography. You had deserts like the Taklamakan, which literally translates to, "Go in and you won't come out." Very reassuring. You had the Pamir Mountains, which might as well have been labeled, "Congratulations, you've chosen frostbite." And then you had endless steppes, which were basically flat nothingness with bonus nomadic raiders. Every possible natural obstacle was included in the Silk Road package. This is why stopping points like Kashgar were so important. Kashgar sat at the crossroads where routes split north and south of the Taklamakan Desert, and it became this bustling hub of weary travelers, dusty goods, and endless haggling. Imagine the smell of 1,000 camels crammed together, merchants arguing in 10 languages, and some poor innkeeper yelling because someone's goat got loose again. That was the Silk Road vibe. And yet, despite the dust, the danger, and the constant sense that you were probably being ripped off, the Silk Road flourished. Not because people enjoyed it, nobody enjoyed it, but because the profits were just too good. You buy silk in China for one price, drag it west and sell it in Rome for 10 times the amount. That kind of markup made all the camel blisters worth it. So as we drift along this imaginary caravan, remember, the Silk Road wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble. It was dusty, dangerous, and deeply annoying. But it worked. It connected empires that never met face to face. It spread religions, ideas, and diseases with equal efficiency. And in the middle, you had the Persians, Sogdians, Parthians, Kushans, and countless others, all cashing in on being the world's most irritating yet indispensable middlemen. Let's shuffle westward a little more now, past the deserts, past the mountain passes, into the Byzantine Empire, and later the Islamic Golden Age, where silk didn't just move, it transformed.
So we've trudged through Central Asia, dodged Parthian toll booths, and endured the smell of Kashgar's 1,000 camels. Now our imaginary caravan lumbers westward into the lands of the Byzantines. And if you thought the Romans were dramatic about silk, well, the Byzantines said, "Hold my goblet of watered-down wine." Because silk in Byzantium wasn't just fabric, it was politics, power, and propaganda all rolled up into shiny robes. The Byzantines took one look at how much the Roman elite had loved silk and decided to crank it up to 11. By the 6th century CE, silk had become a full-blown imperial obsession. Emperors wore it to look holy and untouchable. Bishops wore it because, apparently, God appreciated good fashion. Even the court eunuchs wore it, and you know things are serious when eunuchs get a glow-up. Ordinary people? Forget it. Pure silk was banned for the masses. Not that this stopped anyone. Smugglers thrived because if humans love anything more than luxury, it's sneaking luxury past customs. Now, the problem was, Byzantium didn't actually make silk. They had to buy it, which meant they were at the mercy of those awkward middlemen. Persians, Sogdians, and basically anyone between Constantinople and China. And the Persians, bless them, charged outrageous prices, which drove the Byzantines absolutely nuts. And then came Emperor Justinian I. You might remember him as the guy who built the Hagia Sophia, tried to reconquer half of the old Roman Empire, and accidentally oversaw one of the deadliest plagues in history. Busy man. But on his long to-do list, there was also this: stop overpaying for bug spit cloth. Enter one of the most bizarre episodes of Silk Road history, the silkworm heist. So the story goes, sometime in the 6th century, a pair of monks who had been hanging out in China, probably pretending to spread Christianity while secretly taking notes on everything, came back to Justinian with a juicy secret. They had learned how silk was made. And no, not just boil the cocoons, but the whole deal. The mulberry trees, the silkworms, the entire production line. Of course, you couldn't exactly carry a bunch of squirmy worms across the Silk Road without raising suspicions, so in true monk Mission Impossible fashion, they smuggled silkworm eggs inside hollowed-out bamboo canes, just casually strolling back west with their holy staffs full of bug babies, because that's not suspicious at all. When they handed these contraband canes over to Justinian, it changed everything. Suddenly, Byzantium didn't need to buy silk. They could make it. And oh, did they. The imperial government immediately set up silk workshops. Not private businesses, mind you, but state-controlled factories. Because if there's one thing Justinian loved, it was micromanaging an empire. From then on, Byzantium silk became the luxury item of Europe and the Mediterranean. They controlled production, they controlled sales, and they made sure everyone knew that the emperor literally held the keys to shiny fashion. Want to bribe a foreign ruler? Send them a Byzantine silk robe. Want to flex on your enemies? Show up to negotiations wrapped in silk like a divine burrito. The Byzantines weaponized fabric. Meanwhile, further south,
the Islamic caliphates were also getting in on the action. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Islam had spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain, which meant new rulers sitting right across those key Silk Road routes. And unlike some empires that just taxed caravans, the Islamic world went full entrepreneur mode. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became dazzling trade hubs. They didn't just import silk, they started weaving their own. They blended designs from China, Persia, and Byzantium, creating these insanely detailed fabrics with gold thread, geometric patterns, and calligraphy woven in. Silk wasn't just clothing, it was art. And if you think Islamic architecture is pretty, their fabrics were basically the same aesthetic, just wearable. Baghdad especially became a superstar. Founded in the 8th century by the Abbasid caliphs, it was deliberately placed to control east-west trade. Imagine endless markets filled with silk, spices, books, perfumes, and suspiciously large bags of dates. Scholars hung out in libraries, translating Greek texts into Arabic. Merchants haggled loudly in every dialect under the sun. Poets complained about camel smells. Baghdad was basically New York City of the 9th century, minus the subway rats. And here's the thing. While Europe was still fumbling around in what people like to call the Dark Ages, the Islamic world was glowing. Silk from the East passed through Muslim lands, got remixed into stunning new designs, and then trickled westward into Europe, where nobles drooled over it and peasants probably didn't even know it existed. Of course, this also meant the Islamic empires became filthy rich middlemen. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, later the Fatimids, they all took their cut. And unlike the Persians who just taxed stuff, the Muslims built entire industries around silk. So when you picture some medieval European knight in fancy embroidered robes, chances are that cloth was made in Cairo or Baghdad, not Constantinople or China. Now, all of this, Byzantines fording silkworms, Arabs running massive trade networks, Persians toll boothing like champions, made the Silk Road less of a road and more of a political tug-of-war. Who controlled the trade routes? Who got to tax the caravans? Who monopolized production? It was like Monopoly, but with camels and more dust. And much like Monopoly, it usually ended in bankruptcy and family feuds. And through all of this, the actual travelers, the merchants and caravan hands, were probably just tired. Imagine trudging along for weeks, dodging bandits, dealing with bribes at every city gate, listening to the endless chewing noises of camels, only to arrive in Baghdad and have some scribe haggle you down so aggressively you wonder if the silk was even worth it. But for the cities, for the empires, for the elites lounging in their shimmering robes, it was worth it. Silk wasn't just cloth, it was power, it was wealth, it was the visual proof that you were connected to the great arteries of global trade. The Byzantines flexed it, the Abbasids refined it, and somewhere in the background, monks were still patting themselves on the back for their successful bug smuggling mission. So, as we drift westward now, silk firmly woven into the fabric of Europe and the Middle East, the question becomes, what happens when the Europeans finally stop just drooling over silk and actually start joining the game themselves? Spoiler, they're going to make it awkward.
So, while the Byzantines and Abbasids were out here living their best silk-swathed lives, Western Europe was, well, let's say behind the trend. Imagine the cool kids at school all wearing designer silk jackets, while Western Europe was still trying to figure out how to wash their wool without shrinking it. That's basically the situation until about the 11th century. For centuries, Europe got its silk secondhand. Byzantine silk trickled west, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through smugglers, and sometimes through sheer theft. The Islamic empires sold their versions at a markup, and European nobles paid through the nose because nothing screams, "I'm better than you," at a medieval feast like showing up in a shiny imported robe while everyone else looks like a potato sack. But then came the Crusades. Ah yes, the Crusades. A centuries-long series of awkward military tourism projects where European knights charged into the Holy Land, promptly melted in the heat, and realized they were wildly out of their depth. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the crusade details, mostly because there were a lot of them, and honestly, even medieval chroniclers lost track. But the important part here is this: the Crusaders came face to face with the wealth of the Islamic world. They saw silk everywhere. Silken tents, silken robes, silken banners fluttering dramatically in the desert wind while they stood there in sweaty chainmail, wondering why their god hated them. And when the Crusaders eventually stumbled back home, minus a few limbs, plus a few diseases, they carried stories of riches, of spices, perfumes, sugar, and most importantly, silk. Suddenly, Western Europe had a taste for luxury it couldn't afford and definitely couldn't produce, which naturally meant they became dependent on the middlemen once again. Enter the Italians, because if there's one thing Italy has always been good at, it's business. Cities like Venice and Genoa saw an opportunity. They had the ships, they had the trade networks, and they had absolutely no shame about charging extortionate prices, so they dove headfirst into Silk Road commerce. Venice especially became the superstar. By the 13th century, Venetian merchants were practically running the import-export scene for luxury goods into Europe. They bought silk in Constantinople or Alexandria, hauled it back on their ships, and sold it at obscene markups in European markets. Venetian merchants became so rich and annoying that everyone else in Europe both envied them and plotted their downfall. Standard Italian behavior, really. And of course, this is where we meet our favorite travel influencer of the Middle Ages, Marco Polo. Now, Marco Polo's story is one of those things people either love or roll their eyes at. Born in Venice in 1254, he was the son of a merchant family that already dabbled in Eastern trade. At 17, Marco tagged along with his dad and uncle on what was basically the longest business trip ever. They didn't just go to Constantinople or Antioch. Oh no, they marched straight across Asia to the court of Kublai Khan in China. Supposedly, Marco Polo spent about 20 years in Mongol territory, serving as some kind of envoy for the Khan, picking up languages, gawking at riches, and taking endless mental notes. When he finally returned to Venice in the 1290s, he had the kind of stories that made people lean in at dinner parties and whisper, "Did he just make half of that up?" Because here's the thing, Marco Polo's travels became Europe's ultimate Silk Road guidebook. But historians are still split on how much of it he actually saw. Did he really work for Kublai Khan? Did he really visit all those places? Or did he just embellish the stories he'd heard from Persian merchants along the way? Honestly, nobody's sure, but his book was so detailed, describing paper money, coal, porcelain, silk production, that it blew European minds. Imagine being a medieval peasant who thought Paris was the height of civilization, then hearing about cities in China with millions of people, giant canals and markets overflowing with luxury. Marco Polo's stories made Europe realize just how small and shabby it was compared to the East, which, of course, fueled even more obsession with silk, spices, and everything else they couldn't get enough of. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Venice and Genoa weren't just importing silk, they started producing it. By the late Middle Ages, Italian cities had stolen enough knowledge, smuggled enough silkworms, and hired enough weavers from the East to set up their own silk industries. Places like Lucca, Florence, and Venice became centers of European silk weaving. Sure, their fabrics weren't as good as Chinese silk at first, but they improved fast, because nothing motivates innovation than not wanting to pay middlemen prices anymore. Of course, all of this came with drama. Venetian merchants got into constant fights with Genoese merchants. The Byzantines alternately traded with and fought against the Italians. The Islamic empires kept shifting who controlled the ports. And through it all, caravans still trudged across Central Asia because demand for silk wasn't slowing down anytime soon. But here's where things start to turn. By the 14th century, the Silk Road wasn't just carrying silk, it was also carrying death. Yep, cue the Black Death, hitching a ride on fleas, rats, and trade caravans from Asia to Europe. By 1347, plague ships were docking in Italian ports, and within a few years, Europe had lost somewhere between a third and one-half of its population. It's a bit grim for bedtime history, I know, but it does highlight just how connected the world had become thanks to the Silk Road. Goods, ideas, religions, diseases,
All of it moved along those dusty paths. You couldn't separate the silk from the side effects. And yet, even with plague wiping out millions, the demand for silk didn't die. If anything, surviving elites doubled down on showing off wealth, because nothing says I lived through a pandemic like draping yourself in gold-threaded silk while your peasants are still coughing in the background. So by the end of the Middle Ages, Western Europe had fully joined the silk craze. Italy was weaving it, nobles were hoarding it, and Venetian merchants were practically printing money off it. The Silk Road was still grinding along, but something new was about to shake things up: the age of maritime trade. Because as much as caravans and camels had done the job for centuries, Europeans were starting to think, what if we just sailed directly to Asia instead of paying a dozen middlemen? And that little thought would eventually launch an era of exploration, colonization, and all sorts of awkward encounters on the high seas. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, picture Venice at its peak: glittering palaces, ships groaning with silk, merchants squabbling in the piazza, and somewhere out there, Marco Polo probably still insisting, no seriously, I did meet Kublai Khan.
So far, the Silk Road has been all about land. Deserts, mountain passes, tired camels, and middlemen charging too much for water and bread. But by the 15th century, Europe had started asking the obvious question: why are we still walking? We have boats. And honestly, fair point. For over 1,000 years, Europeans had grumbled about how expensive silk and spices were. They moaned about Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, Venetians, Ottomans, basically anyone standing between them and Asia. And finally, someone in Portugal looked at a map and thought, what if we just sail around Africa and cut out the middle guys? Enter Prince Henry the Navigator, which is a funny nickname because he didn't actually do much navigating. He mostly sat in Portugal while hiring other people to risk their lives on the ocean. But branding is everything, and Henry got the credit. His push for maritime exploration set Portugal on the path to rounding Africa, eventually reaching India in 1498 with Vasco da Gama. Now, Vasco's trip was not exactly glamorous. Half his crew died of scurvy, they got lost a lot, and when they finally showed up in Calicut, India, they were basically laughed at for bringing worthless trade goods. But still, they had proven the concept. Europe could sail directly to Asia. No more camels, no more tolls in Samarkand, just ships, storms, and the occasional pirate. Meanwhile, Spain said, well, if Portugal can do it, we can too. But instead of going around Africa, they banked on this random Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who swore the world was smaller than it actually was. Spoiler, he was wrong. Instead of reaching Asia, he ran into the Americas, which was awkward, but hey, he found gold and people to exploit, so Spain decided it was still a win. For the Silk Road, this was the beginning of the end. Because once Europeans realized they could access Asia by sea, the land routes slowly started losing relevance. Why trudge through deserts and bribe 50 tax collectors when you could just load up a ship, hope you didn't sink, and reach India with cargo holds full of pepper? And speaking of pepper, let's pause here, because silk wasn't actually the main prize anymore. By the 15th century, Europeans were even more obsessed with spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, stuff that today you might just sprinkle on toast or pumpkin pie, was once worth literal gold. People went bankrupt trying to buy nutmeg. Wars were fought over cloves. If you think that sounds insane, just remember, medieval European food was so bland and rotten that people would pay anything to mask the taste. But silk was still in the mix. Chinese and Indian silk remained in high demand, and as maritime trade routes expanded, silk joined spices, porcelain, and tea on ships heading west. The old Silk Road wasn't gone overnight. Caravans still trudged along for centuries, but its golden age was over. Now, while Portugal and Spain were busy carving out sea empires, Venice had a meltdown. For centuries, Venetian merchants had milked the Silk Road system, but suddenly all these Portuguese and Spanish ships were bypassing them. Venice went from being the cool kid with all the exotic goods to the sad older sibling watching new kids take over the playground.
They tried to adapt, but the sea trade was just too efficient. And then came the Ottomans. Oh yes, the Ottomans. By the 15th century, they had gobbled up Constantinople, in 1453 for those keeping score, and turned it into Istanbul. They controlled the eastern Mediterranean, the old Byzantine lands, and most of the key routes from Asia, which meant they basically strangled what was left of overland trade and funneled it through their empire. Naturally, they charged ridiculous tolls, which only made Europeans more desperate to find alternative routes. So in a way, you can thank the Ottomans for accidentally sparking the age of exploration. By being so good at taxing caravans, they pushed Europe to say, fine, we'll just build better boats. And those boats eventually circled the entire globe. Now, let's drift back east for a second, because the Mongols deserve a mention here too. Remember them? Back in the 13th century, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and later Kublai Khan had actually revived the Silk Road in a big way. For about a century, there was this thing historians love to call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which is hilarious because the Mongols weren't exactly peaceful. But once they'd finished conquering and burning everything, they did create a massive unified empire that made Silk Road trade safer than it had been in centuries. Merchants could actually travel long distances without constant bandit attacks. Caravans moved freely. Marco Polo thrived in this environment. But when the Mongol Empire fragmented, so did that stability. Suddenly, the road was back to being a patchwork of risky territories, and that instability only made the sea routes more attractive later on. So by the 16th century, the Silk Road was fading. The caravans were still out there, plodding along, but the big money was flowing by ship. The Portuguese dominated for a while, then the Spanish, then the Dutch and the British showed up like the overachieving kids at a science fair, building massive global trade empires. And silk? It remained iconic. By the 17th century, Europeans weren't just importing it, they were imitating it. France and England both built up their own silk weaving industries. Lyon in France became famous for silk, especially under Louis XIV, who basically wallpapered Versailles in it. England's Spitalfields district in London got filled with Huguenot weavers producing fancy fabrics. Silk was no longer just an exotic import, it had gone global. But at the root of it all, those little silkworms on their mulberry leaves in China were still the source. No matter how far silk traveled, no matter how many empires taxed it, no matter how many Europeans tried to copy it, the thread always went back to those worms spinning their cocoons. Which is oddly poetic if you think about it. Humanity built wars, cities, and empires around bug spit. And as the maritime world boomed, the Silk Road slowly slipped into legend. By the 18th century, it was less an active trade network and more a romantic memory of camel caravans trudging through golden sands, which honestly is exactly the kind of thing historians love to get misty-eyed about. So, the Silk Road story isn't one of a clean rise and fall. It's more of a long, dusty shuffle that eventually got outpaced by boats. For over 1,000 years, it connected east and west, carried silk and spices, spread religions and diseases, and shaped empires. And then, when the ocean highways opened, it quietly faded into the background, leaving behind ruins of caravanserais, legends of Marco Polo, and a trail of overpriced silk robes in European wardrobes. But before we let the camels rest for good, let's take one more slow wander. Because the Silk Road might have ended as an economic powerhouse, but as a cultural highway, its legacy lingers on.
So picture this. It's the 18th century. Europe is fully obsessed with its ships, colonizing everything it can reach and drawing questionable maps of the world. The Silk Road, once the glamorous backbone of global trade, has become, let's just say, the backroads of history. Caravans are still out there, yes, plodding through dust storms and mountain passes, but the big business has moved to the sea. The Silk Road is no longer the star of the show. But here's the thing, you can't just erase 1,000+ years of cultural mingling. Even when the caravans slowed down, the road had already left behind an incredible cultural imprint. Religions, languages, art, and food all permanently scrambled across continents because some trader once decided to swap a horse for a roll of silk. Take religion, for example. The Silk Road was basically the original spiritual highway. Buddhism spread from India into China, Korea, and Japan, thanks to monks traveling along those dusty caravan trails. Islam rode the road west into Central Asia and east into China. Nestorian Christianity, yes, that tiny branch of Christianity most people forget existed, managed to hitch a ride all the way into China, too. Zoroastrian fire temples popped up in odd places, just as Islamic calligraphy appeared in silk patterns. All because people were moving and talking while waiting for their camels to stop spitting. And let's not forget disease. We've mentioned it, but it deserves one last sleepy nod. The Black Death didn't just happen out of nowhere. It piggybacked along the Silk Road, moving with rats, fleas, and humans from Asia into Europe. Which means that in a dark, ironic way, the Silk Road shaped not just cultures, but population numbers. Medieval Europe's entire trajectory shifted because of trade routes, carrying death. Thanks, fleas! But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Art also had a field day. Chinese motifs blended in with Persian miniatures. Islamic geometric patterns found their way onto European fabrics. The world's decorative vocabulary basically became one giant remix tape curated by merchants who probably didn't even realize they were making art history. A piece of pottery in Samarkand might have Persian shapes, Chinese glazes, and an Arabic inscription. That's what happens when you make a global highway. Everything gets mashed together. Even languages got scrambled. Along the Silk Road, you had entire towns speaking multiple tongues just to get by. Merchants needed to haggle in Persian, bargain in Turkic, chat in Arabic, scribble in Chinese. The result was a messy but fascinating linguistic soup. It wasn't exactly Esperanto, but it was the closest medieval traders ever got. Now, fast forward again. By the 19th century, the Silk Road had become less of a functioning trade route and more of a historical curiosity. European explorers loved to retrace parts of it, writing long and usually self-important travel logs about crossing deserts and rediscovering ancient cities that locals had been living in the whole time. You know, classic explorer energy. This is also when archaeologists got involved, digging up old caravansaries, temples, manuscripts, and artifacts left behind along the road. Suddenly, the Silk Road became a story about lost civilizations, ruined cities swallowed by sand, and forgotten manuscripts rescued from caves. In other words, it became romantic. People loved to imagine it as this golden thread tying the world together in mystery and adventure. Which is funny because for most people actually living on the Silk Road, it wasn't romantic at all. It was hot, dusty, dangerous, and occasionally deadly. Merchants weren't writing poetry about the shimmering sands, they were swatting flies and wondering how many tolls they'd have to pay before the next city. But hey, history has a way of polishing things up for the storytelling market. And let's not forget the food legacy. Because yes, spaghetti. Sorry, Italy, but your national dish owes a quiet debt to Chinese noodles traveling along the Silk Road. The tomato part came later from the Americas, but the idea of long, stretchy wheat noodles definitely had an Eastern origin. Even dumplings, a staple from China to Poland, spread along this culinary highway. You've got momo in Tibet, mantu in Central Asia, pierogi in Eastern Europe, all cousins, all descended from dough wrapped around filling, carried along by traders too tired to invent something new. Tea is another legacy. Tea culture in China was ancient, but it spread west along the Silk Road, eventually becoming a global obsession. Russia, for example, became a massive tea importer via overland caravans. To this day, samovars and endless cups of tea are a Russian tradition with roots in Silk Road trade. And even in modern times, the Silk Road refuses to fully die. In the 20th century, as railroads and highways expanded, people kept using the phrase Silk Road as a nostalgic label. And now, in the 21st century, China has literally branded its big infrastructure project the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially a massive attempt to recreate the old trade connections with new roads, railways, and shipping lines. Proof that the romance of the Silk Road is too good to let go.